Hi, and welcome to the Captioned Life, a show for the most casual and dedicated fans of comics and a member of the Comic Watch family. I'm your host, Sean. Join me and discover what the world of comics and graphic novels have to offer. From one-on-one interviews with industry professionals, roundtable discussions with passionate fans, and reviews on the latest comics, TV shows, and movies. Now let's dive right on in. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the show. When it comes to comics and the things that we love about them, one of the critical parts of comics and stories are the characters. And the thing that we love about the characters is what makes up their identity and personality. And a lot of times we see that a little bit of ourselves in those people and those characters. And we can also talk about what makes up their identity in terms of ethnicity, in terms of religion, in terms of race, a lot of things that really makes the character who they are. And so in today's episode, I would like to talk about Jewish representation in comics. And I asked somebody to come on our show who I think is an expert in this area, given her educational background. So please welcome Sasha Kaplan. Sasha is a comic book historian and pop culture commentator, having recently completed her master's degree in history. Sasha often speaks on Jewish representation in the comic book industry at comic book conventions and private events, including the Hillels, universities, and high schools. Sasha, how you doing today?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me.
I really enjoy having you. We were, chatting right before we were recording, and I feel like I could just have a conversation with you for hours, like, very friendly. And I feel like it's never boring. We always just, it's like just a natural conversation that we have is like a stream of consciousness. And I really enjoy that. And congratulations to you getting your master's in history. I know you've been working hard on that. You're part of Comic Watch as well, too, which is how we know each other. And you've been sharing with us, that whole journey in history of you getting that degree. And so I want to say congratulations to you on that.
Thank you. Thank you. It was, I think like even back in August, I told everybody on Comic Watch, I was like, guys, I'm not here. I'm like dead. I am dead to the world.
Yes.
I couldn't do anything. The thesis took up like my entire life, literally.
Yeah. No, and we completely understood. Like it's definitely not an easy journey to do that for any, degree, but, with master's degree, you kind of have to, lock yourself in a room and try to get that done. So, in your bio, I wanted to ask you, because I don't think everybody knows what this is, but you say that you speak at Hillels. Do you want to share with us what a Hillel is?
Yeah, that's a great question. So a Hillel is, Hillel International is like I think they're an international organization that provides college students that are Jewish with education opportunities to have events with different speakers. They do Shabbat dinners and holiday services that are usually like reform or conservative, not necessarily Orthodox, something like another organization, Chabad, does that. But they're kind of a resource for the Jewish community on the campus to just have a place to go to be Jewish and to practice Judaism.
Yeah.
And eat food.
I feel like anytime there's a college organization, you have to provide food. Otherwise students won't come. Right.
I mean, yeah. The benefit here though, is that these are dinners that the Hillel hosts. Chabad does too, like every Shabbat, which is sundown on Friday. So it's a good time to just put away your phone and to be there with your fellow Jewish communities, whether you're on campus or not. And just you do your prayers and services, and then you have food, and it's a good time.
Right. Yeah. And a lot of, I know the bigger state campuses, at least that I have worked at or visited, they all have Hillel centers that, they're definitely in a particular building, but they go out and do stuff on the campus all the time and everything. So if you go to a larger state university, they're definitely have a large presence there. One of the things that you have brought up is I know my own background, and we talked about this before we started recording, is that, I grew up Catholic. I actually have a undergrad degree in Catholic studies, and I'm not Catholic anymore. But
this is basically Daredevil and Kitty Pryde having a conversation, I feel like. Or do you want to be Nightcrawler?
Oh, it's definitely Daredevil. I would definitely do Nightcrawler, but I definitely have to tap into Daredevil, especially. I don't want to go too far off the rails on this, but at some point I need to have a conversation about when we say Daredevil's Catholic, like, what does that actually mean? And because, like, Matt Murdock is a little bit of he sleeps around and stuff like that, and like in the Catholic Church, that is not something that you do before marriage. And so, but everyone identifies him as he's a Catholic and he's a devout Catholic, except for when it comes to that, apparently. So, but yeah, so one of the things that when I was growing up is at the university, like they have campus ministry stuff, and it sounds like Hillel might be kind of like that, where where they provide some sort of, just like what you said, like religious services and resources and things like that. But you also mentioned earlier that there's another like organization that does something a little bit different than that. Is that right?
Yeah. So, okay. So bear in mind, I'm not an expert on this at all. I am
That's
not,
fine.
I don't work for Hillel. I don't work for Chabad.
Right.
But so Chabad is like more Orthodox Judaism. So they're a little bit more stricter in their religious observance than Hillel would be. And they are usually, Chabad is also an international organization, but they are not necessarily only on the campus. They do a lot of community work, whereas Hillel's, I think, are majority, if not all of them, are on the campus.
Gotcha. Okay.
So Hillel also, just like Chabad, they have their own rabbi to help conduct services and do stuff, at least as far as I know.
Gotcha. Okay. No, that makes sense. Thank you for explaining that, because I knew what a Hillel was, but I know a lot of people that might be listening may not know what it is. I want to make sure that people, got at least a little bit of understanding once we start talking about that. And what's interesting is that Kevin and I did a episode of like famous places that inspired things in the comics. And the headquarters for the Power Rangers show that came out, I think, in the early 90s was based on, I don't know if it was the Hillel building, but it was definitely a building that was on a Jewish college or Jewish campus somewhere as well too. So I'm pretty sure it's a Hillel Center, but I could be wrong about that. So
I don't think I know it. I think this is one of those things where we should probably Google it.
Yeah.
And verify.
Yeah.
Because I don't know. I know that it was a building on a campus of some sort.
Yeah.
But I don't think it was specifically Jewish, but I don't know.
Yeah.
But just to preface, Hillel doesn't just do religious stuff. They do also do a lot of they do like speakers that come to the campus. They recruit for like trips to Israel. So they do a lot of stuff that's just like not just religious services.
Right. Yeah.
But so does Chabad. So it's a lot of just like community outreach and, fostering a Jewish community on the campus.
Right. Yeah. I'm trying to look up real quick, and I mean, I'm probably not using the right phrase for it or anything like that. But yeah, I'll look it up a little bit later. We'll kind of figure that out. So I know there was, I remember when we did it, there was some sort of Jewish connection there. I just can't remember if it was like a
Found
Jewish
it.
college or, okay. What is it?
The Simi Valley. The building is called the House of the Book. It is located on the American Jewish University's Brandeis Bardin campus in Simi Valley, California. So I don't know what the American Jewish Universities.
Yes. And I think it's out in California somewhere too.
Yeah, Simi Valley. I hope I'm not mispronouncing that. California.
Yeah. So, okay. So now we know. Yeah. So anyways, we kind of got off track there a little bit. And that is totally my fault. I am sorry about that. But thank you for explaining Hillel and some of those differences, because I think sometimes, at least specifically for me as well, I when I went to college, I did take a few courses in Judaism that was taught by a rabbi, and it was really insightful to know, some of the preconceived notions I've had about the Jewish religion, but also some of the differences and assumptions I made about Judaism based on my own upbringing in Catholicism, things like that. And so I know there's a lot of stuff that kind of gets warped because of those things. And so it was really interesting to hear you talk about Hillel, how it's, not just, kind of like the campus ministry stuff, but they also do a lot of programmatic things as well too. So that was really good.
I mean, any Jewish organization that's on the campus tends to do kind of a little bit of everything, particularly Hillel and Chabad, just because it's important that all students, whether they are very, very religious or they are maybe not as religious, but still want to, keep their faith and do services, have those opportunities.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. Good. Well, thank you very much again for joining the show. So we're going to talk about Jewish representation in comics. But before we get into that, I like to ask our guests the same question. That is your comic book origin story. What got you into comics?
Oh, okay. So this is like this is complicated. Because
That's fine.
it's not a straightforward story. And this is actually in my thesis, but when you do a dedication or something, you
Hmm.
do like, like you wanna not a dedication, but the other one, like you're giving notes and thanks to like people and
Oh, like
everything.
recognition or something like
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Acknowledgments.
Yes, that's it. There we
That's
go.
it. Yeah.
And so the acknowledgement, I had many acknowledgements, but one of the ones that I had was a thank you to my parents for making the mistake of buying me my first comic book, which was not a superhero comic book.
Ooh, cool.
It was Tom and Jerry comic book.
Oh, that's awesome.
There's like a picture of me sitting on the beach, on a rocky beach, like no sand. So super comfortable.
Yeah, yeah.
In like my little bathing suit and these big sunglasses reading this comic book. And then, once I sort of grew a little bit more confident in my reading, I guess I moved on to like bigger books and everything.
Mm-hmm.
But then I had friends as I grew older in like middle school who like try to get me to like anime. And so I read a couple of mangas.
Mm-hmm.
And then high school happened, and my high school library actually had a comic book section.
Nice.
And it was sort of like, it was tucked away inside the librarian's office, but you could like go in. But I think the superhero obsession started in the 90s, as most things do for millennials, which was the 90s, X-Men and Spider-Man cartoons, and then Batman the Animated Series, and then Teen Titans. And so those were all of the characters that were sort of floating in my head as I'm sitting in my high school library reading all of these, Ultimate Spider-Man and X-Men comics and Captain America comics. And then I remember picking up this one comic. It was called Young Avengers. And I remember just laughing my butt off at it. Like, oh, this is just a Marvel rip-off Teen Titans. And I just like put it back on the shelf and forgot about it. Right. And then after a while, I just caved and I said, okay, fine. I will pick up this ridiculous looking comic book called Young Avengers, written by this guy named Alan Heinberg. And I was already like into comics by then. Right. But this is where the comics became more than just, I'm going to casually read this. This is like the moment where they became like a lifestyle choice.
Yeah, yeah.
And so I definitely own Alan Heinberg and Jim Chung a big thank you for releasing Young Avengers so that I could begrudgingly read it and fall absolutely in love with the characters.
That's awesome. I love hearing that. And it's very unique because I don't think I've had anyone say their first comic was a Tom and Jerry comic, or I mean, now I think about like a non-superhero type of comic, but of all non-superhero comics, like I thought you were going to go along the ways of Archie or something like that, because that was the next thing that came to mind. But Tom and Jerry, that you can't go wrong with that. So yeah, that's a great story. Thank you for sharing that. I love that.
The thing is so I was born and grew up part of my life in Russia until I immigrated to America with my family. So I don't know if they were actually like released in the United States. I looked on eBay once and there were Tom and Jerry comics. Right. But obviously I didn't read them in English because I didn't speak English, let alone read English. So it'd be interesting to see if I could find like the English equivalent of the comics I read as a 5-year-old. Probably would remember them.
Yeah. Do you remember like what the issue was or the year or anything? So you would have to try to find the cover issue. Like,
I'm not going to say what year it was because we're not playing that game.
Right. No. I just meant when the issue came out. We don't know. Yeah.
I honestly don't know. I probably cannot even tell you like off the top of my head where my dad got the comic. Yeah. So just know that that's where it started.
No, I love that. That's great. Thank you for sharing that. And I love the fact that it is part of your thesis for your graduate degree as well too. I think that's
and I think it's verbatim. Really cool. It says that, thanks mom and dad for making the mistake of buying me my first comic book.
Honestly, that's a great way to put it too.
Well, because I think a lot of our parents, constantly talked about how like, oh, comic books are just for kids and like, or, it's just pictures. There's nothing to read. And then
yeah,
lifelong obsession begins.
Yeah. And now you wrote your senior, or I'm sorry, not your senior, but your thesis on, comic book history, or I'm sorry, Judaism and comic books. You write for Comic Watcher.
It was
Oh,
not
was it?
related
Oh,
to
okay.
No. So my thesis was much more macabre than that. It was about death,
Oh, that's
and
right. That's right. Sorry.
but still cool. And I've been writing and talking about Jewish comic book shenanigans
Right.
since I don't even know how far back.
Right. Right. Well, I mean, I love listening to you talk about that. So I'm totally fine with that. So I apologize. I had thought that you had said that and that it was about comics and Jewish identity or something like that. So I must have either made that up in my head or something like that. So I apologize.
Well, that was part of an article I wrote for that was basically the premise of the article I wrote for Comic Watch in August.
Oh, maybe that's what I was thinking of. Yeah.
I am giving a presentation at GalaxyCon Richmond in March.
Oh, cool.
On the subject of Jewish representation in comic book adaptations.
Oh, that's so awesome. Awesome. Thank you. That's so great. And you we'll get to that a little bit later. So, no, but that's awesome. Thank you. So I had a list of questions that I wanted to ask you in terms of comics, but I was just thinking about this. We probably want to talk a little bit about Judaism. And so I know that, I'm probably throwing you a curveball a little bit because I didn't give you a question ahead of time, but I thought it might be good because we were talking about Hillels and misunderstandings earlier. Maybe what are some of the common things that people may misunderstand about Judaism? Like, for example, I know one of the biggest things, I mean, that people don't realize that, Judaism is not just religion, but it's also ethnicity. And so people don't, don't understand or realize that is, part of what makes someone Jewish as well. And so is there anything before we go into, the representation of Jewish people in comics that we might want to be mindful of or kind of keep in mind as we're talking about this when it comes to Judaism in general?
So first, that is the biggest. That's look, if we're going to talk about misconceptions people have about the Jewish people, we would be here forever. It is like true. 5,000 years of expulsions and persecution and right. genocide and pogroms, and I don't even know what I've left out. Like, there's just so much. Yeah. I will say, when it comes to specifically comic books and Jewish representation, I think misconceptions that people have about the Jews. The biggest one is the fact that it's an ethno-religious identity. Now, right. First, I'm going to preface, I'm not a theologian. I am a relatively secular Jew. Mm-hmm. So I'm not an expert on Judaism, the faith, but right. It is something I believe in.
Right. Right.
And so there's so the biggest misconception is that Judaism is just a religion, when it's not. It's an ethno-religious identity.
Right.
Where one person's faith and observance does not change their ethnic identity. It does right. not change their genetic makeup. Like, I've had family and friends take the DNA test and they find out they're like, 99.99% Ashkenazi Jewish or Mizrahi Jewish or Sephardic Jewish, which is Jews that come from different areas of the Jewish diaspora, right? So mm-hmm. the Ashkenazi Jews are Jews that were expelled and found themselves in Europe. The Mizrahi Jews are the Jews that lived in the Middle East and North Africa. Mm-hmm. And Sephardic Jews tend to be Jews from Spain and Portugal, and I think sometimes Morocco.
Right. Yeah.
So, and then, places like Turkey, you have kind of like mix of, Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews. And most of us differ in I think that's the one thing that people just don't know, is that there's different kinds of Jews and Jewish identity, right?
Right. Yeah.
Because of where we ended up in the diaspora, our experiences are different. Mm-hmm. Religious practices are a little bit different. Ashkenazi Jews are, very jealous because there's certain things that Mizrahi Jews can eat on Passover that Ashkenazi Jews can't.
Yeah.
Things like that. So there's but again, the experiences are different, right? Mm-hmm. Jews from the Middle East and North Africa, most of the Middle East and North Africa doesn't have a Jewish community anymore.
Right. Right.
So I think the diversity of the Jewish community mm-hmm. and the diversity of experiences, because, for example, a Jewish person from Ukraine and the former Soviet Union has a completely different Jewish experience than a Jewish person from, I don't know, Denmark or France or Germany.
Right.
So there's also differences in tradition, like maybe just cultural traditions or experiences. And so that I think that's a separate conversation.
Yeah.
But the gist of it here is that Jewish experience is not just the quote unquote American Jewish experience.
Right.
And even within the quote unquote American Jewish experience, there's so much differences depending on where you are geographically, what your Jewish community looks like. You know, you can't really say that like, oh, the Jewish community in, say, New York is exactly the same as the Jewish community in Miami.
Right. Yeah.
So there's a lot of differences and a lot of diversity. And in comics or in pop culture, we don't really see that diversity.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, there's like 5,000 other things I could say, but I think that's the going off what you said, that's the biggest thing that comes to my mind.
Right. Yeah. You know, and you're exactly right. There's a lot of things that we can go into that, but thank you for kind of, giving us the bigger picture in terms of things that we might not be aware of when it comes to Judaism. So let's dive into about Jewish representation in comics. And so the first question I want to ask you is what's the current issue with that representation in comics? And one of the reasons I didn't say this earlier, so I apologize, but one of the reasons why I want to have you on the show to talk about this is because I know in our Comic Watch community, we have Jewish writers on the team, and there's been a lot of conversations about that in comics and also media and things like that. And so I thought it was a really interesting conversation for me to read about as an outsider, just kind of reading and seeing what you all had to say about that. So that's one reason why I want to bring you on here, because I know you have brought up some really good points about, the current issues of Jewish representation in comics. So sorry, I didn't mean to preface all that there, but yeah. So what's the general issues or the current issues with Jewish representation in comics today?
Oh, we're gonna be here all night, aren't we?
I know. Let's do like top three. How about that?
I think there's a lack of Jewish existence in comics, in the sense that, yes, you have Kitty Pryde and she's in the comics. You have Magneto, you have, Batwoman and Ben Grimm and Billy Kaplan and this like slew of like different Jewish characters. But how many comics actually let them be Jewish outside of holiday specials?
Right.
Or in Magneto's case, outside of the Holocaust.
Right.
And it's not to diminish like the power and importance of Magneto's existence as a Holocaust survivor, but oftentimes it's like the only conversation we have around Magneto.
Right.
And the other part is, so Jewish characters aren't really allowed to be Jewish in a significant space. It's more like, here's a holiday special, or here's a Jewish wedding, which is amazing. Like Marvel is the only comic company that I know that had 2 Jewish weddings, or any Jewish weddings, as far as I know.
Right.
So the first being Ben Grimm and Alicia Masters had a Jewish wedding in Fantastic Four, and Billy Kaplan and Teddy Altman had a gay Jewish space wedding in Empire Aftermath, which brought me to tears of joy. So because like I didn't think we could have that. And so it's a lot of I think there's a little bit of ignorance too, because you don't have as many, and I could be wrong about this because I don't work in the comic book industry, but from just casual observation as a fan, I think there's significantly less Jewish involvement in comic books. So, I think everybody knows that the entire comic book industry was founded by these young Jewish people who craved and wanted a hero. Siegel and Schuster created Superman to be a hero for the Jewish community, essentially. All of these, I think Simcha Weinstein, I think that's his name, He wrote a book called Up, Up, and Oy Vey, which gives you it's a great title, right?
I love that. Yeah, that's so great.
It's a really great read for people that don't know the Jewish connection of the comic book industry.
Mm-hmm.
Because you have Siegel and Schuster, you have Bill Finger, you have, Kirby and Simon, and then Goodman and Lee, and so many others. And then, and they created characters that on the surface might not look Jewish, might not be Jewish, but they have so much Jewishness in them.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, for Pete's sake, like, I think every Jew knows Superman is Jewish.
Right.
His name is Kal-El. And, there's like all of these references and subtleties.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a lot of Jewish coding, but
right.
until you get to characters like Magneto and Kitty Pryde and Ben Grimm, even though for Ben it was revealed a little bit later, you don't really have many conversations about being Jewish.
Right.
There's a couple of comics written by Chris Claremont that come to mind where like Kitty talks about being a kid and having her first crush, and then her crush says something anti-Semitic, and then she punches him in the nose or something. Like, yeah, I've been there. Wish I could have done that.
Right.
So there are those moments. Like, most recently, again, Kitty Pryde in the Brian Michael Bendis's X-Men run, she talks about what it means to be being Jewish and a mutant. And I think there's an interesting allegory because for a lot of folks, sometimes we're kind of forced to pick our other identities over our Jewish identity.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not an expert on the queer community, and I would never pretend to be. But I've seen and had conversations about, what it means to be Jewish and gay, and, sometimes there's like this pressure that like, you're not allowed to be both because like people aren't just one thing, right? We're a combination of different identities and different characteristics and experiences. And so I'm getting off topic, but I think there's a lack of space for exploration of Jewish identity in comics.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's definitely not enough Jewish writers and artists and editors in comics anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there is a little bit of an ignorance as to whether it's willful or not, we can debate, but I think there is an ignorance when it comes to listening to Jewish voices on issues.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the last bit is, and I don't know if this is like, sometimes I think people don't understand that although like the Jewish experience in America is significantly like more prosperous than it was in, say, like the pogroms under the Tsar for the Jewish community.
Right.
We are technically a minority in this country.
Mm-hmm.
And we can debate the question of like, to what extent the Jewish community has assimilated, but that's a very general topic. And it's like, It's hard to generalize the Jewish community in America because it's so diverse.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So there's, I think, and that ties into that bit about how Jews are not viewed as an ethno-religious identity. People think it's just a religion. So it's sort of like seeing Jews as like, oh, they're just like the white people that like wear the funny hats.
Right. Right.
As opposed to being a specific ethnic community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No,
even though like obviously like not all Jews are white or have those Eastern European features and etc.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, that's another big thing is people not realizing that it just like what you said earlier, it's very diverse in terms of ethnicity and backgrounds and stuff like that. One of the things that I've also thought about, and you tell me if I'm kind of off the mark on this, but I know there's been some conversations about, how in the early ages of comics, in the golden age, and then kind of creeping into the silver age as well, too, is that you don't see a lot of Jewish representation necessarily. And part of it is because the country was still very anti-Semitic then. And so when they were writing some of their characters, I think there's been some conversation about like how they didn't want to, make that prominent because of that. And so I wonder if that's your understanding as well too, or if I'm completely off the mark. Or
I don't think you're off the mark. I think it's just it's not quite cut and dry. I think to some extent you're right. Anti-Semitism for sure played a big part, especially because they changed their names a little bit so that it was like kind of more neutral. Jacob Kurtzberg became Jack Kirby.
Right.
And things like that. And part of it was like also because the stigma of like, oh, you're a comic book writer. It's like, oh, well, I don't write that under my real name because eventually I'm going to, like Stan Lee always talked about how he was going to go on to write like the great American novel or whatever it was. And he wanted to keep his like last name, Stanley Lieber, for that.
Right. Yeah.
Even though that never, as far as I know, never happened. But I think for that generation of Jews, there was a need to, and it's not a bad thing, but there was a need for acceptance and a need to assimilate and to blend in because these were children of immigrants.
Right.
I believe Jack Kirby's parents had immigrated from, I'm not going to say where because I'm probably going to get it wrong, but had immigrated from Europe. And so, there was a desire to fit in and be like the other kids and the other folks. And, that's something that I think I've struggled with as well, because like, I don't feel like sometimes that I fit in with like the whatever the quote unquote American Jewish community is.
Right.
But there are times where I also don't feel like I fit in with the non-Jewish American world. And so it's, I think that played a part in it. But I think the other thing, and this is where it delved into like the latter half, is I think the concept of conscious representation didn't always come up. It wasn't something that was consciously, I think, at the forefront of their thinking.
Right. It's definitely a different, conversations that they had then than what we're having now about those things. So yeah, I totally see that. So thank you. So now that we talked about some of the issues with representation in comics, what's a really good example of Jewish representation in comics for you that, if you had to tell somebody like this is how a great character or story that represents Judaism or the Jewish people in comics, what would be an example of that?
So that's hard because there are great moments of Jewish representation that I've outlined,
right?
But there isn't like a strictly like Jewish comic that is like, at least within the big two that I can think of. The most recent one though, although Whistle from DC Comics, which came out as a graphic novel, I think last year or 2 years ago. It was written by a Jewish writer, I believe, and I thought it could have done a little bit more with the exploration of identity and, standing up for the Jewish community aspects. But it does feature a Jewish character as the lead. And it goes through her journey of like her mom. And there is some talk about like what it means to be Jewish and how people treat other Jews or how people treat Jews, excuse me. So that is, I think, a first for me. There's like, independent comic books that have come out more recently that I'm still trying to get my hands on to kind of see how they tackle that question. The one that people tend to always recommend to me is The Adventures of Cavalier and Clay. I think that has some of those elements as well, because it echoes so much of like the early comic book industry. But in terms of mainstream superhero comics, which is in case this wall behind me is an obvious, tends to be my area of expertise.
Right.
I think there's a lot of really good moments. I think anytime you read anything about Magneto and his struggle as a Holocaust survivor, really resonates very well. There's a moment even as part of the story. I can't remember what issue it is. It's in X-Men 200 something, maybe.
Okay.
Maybe it's in this one. It's Uncanny X-Men 200. But within some of those issues, as part of like, I don't know, Magneto's like repentance or him trying to be a good guy, he and Kitty Pryde end up going to a kind of a reunion for Holocaust survivors. And Kitty talks about, I think, her aunt, who was a survivor who had passed away recently. And several people recognize Magneto as the person that like saved them or something like that. So that's a really powerful moment, I think, for Magneto and for the other one is X-Men Magneto's Testaments, which was, I think, 5 issues that came out 2005 maybe. it explores Magneto's childhood as a Holocaust survivor, and is the first comic to actually reveal that Eric Lenscher is not his birth name. Because Lenscher is not a Jewish last name at all in any way. I think it translates to like feudal lord or something.
Oh.
Like even when Jews
Okay.
had to pick last names, this was
Right.
not what they would have chosen.
Right.
So it talks about his childhood as this little Jewish kid named Max
Mhm.
in Nuremberg, I think, in Germany. And how at one point he's basically just like kicked out of school, even though this is the school he's been going to every day.
Right.
Because he's Jewish and Jews aren't allowed to go to school with the German kids anymore.
Mhm.
And it, I think, covers how he arrives to the concentration camp, his experience in the camp, and then ultimately escaping the camp with Magda.
Mhm.
I haven't read it in a while, but it was so strong. I think anytime you have a comic like Mouse or like Magneto's Testament that like brings that to you, not just in a written way, but in a visual way,
Right.
it just, I don't know, like I can't watch Holocaust movies, but for some reason comic books resonate with me in this way. And
Mhm.
I feel like I can get through them in a way that I can't do with books or movies. And maybe that's just me being weird. Um, but I think there's a few, like I said, there's great moments like when Ben Grimm realizes that he's like in his 13th year of being the Thing,
Mhm.
and he ends up having like a second bar mitzvah. I jokingly call it the Thing mitzvah. Um,
I
and
love
he
that.
he reads from the Torah.
Uh-huh.
And he has previously he had like a moment with a gentleman in his neighborhood who
Mhm.
was Jewish, and I think he got attacked or something, and he was there for him. So there are these beautiful moments. And of course, the gay Jewish space wedding that I will talk to until I cannot talk anymore. Because it's so good and it's so beautiful.
Mhm.
And Billy Kaplan, to the surprise of absolutely no one who's met me for more than 5 minutes, is like my absolute favorite my favorite character, I think, in all of comics in general, let alone Jewish ones.
Right.
But so there are these moments and there are these like, one-off parts that are not part of the main story. But, if you look at Daredevil, if you look at Nightcrawler, if you look at Miss Marvel, if you look at, Monet St. Croix,
Mhm.
there are comics that talk about faith and religion. They talk
Mhm.
about religious observance. They talk about the struggle of faith. They talk about what it means to be a religious person in a secular community. All of these things that are so important and they're wonderful. We don't really get that.
Right. Right.
So I would love to see like, but again, like you have Jewish moments. Moon Knight in a later arc that the character has, they do like a retcon of his childhood,
Mhm.
has a little bit of like him growing up in an Orthodox community and his experiences there.
Right.
His first comic really talked about him like, or no, sorry, same comic. Maybe it was a different one. Too many comic book runs. Talked about him facing anti-Semitism and getting beat up because not only was he Jewish, he wore
Mhm.
a kippah. He could be visibly identified in some way as Jewish.
Mm. Right. Yeah. I so that's a good point that you brought up because I think that also goes into kind of my next question or at least topic of discussion is how these things also translate into the big screen, whether it's movies or streaming shows or television shows. And Moon Knight, I will say this: like, even though I am not Jewish, I'm a former Catholic and all that. I will say that the way that Moon Knight was treated in the Disney Plus series, I was a little bit disappointed about the Jewish representation. And the biggest thing, I would say that I was already a little bit disappointed, but I think what doubled down on that is I remember reading the producer or the director of Moon Knight saying that he believes that everyone would be really happy with how they handle his Jewish identity and representation in the show. And for me, when I saw it, it was like two scenes that didn't really contribute to the story. Like if you took those things out, it wouldn't have changed the story. And so I was really flabbergasted by how they thought this was, a great representation. And I don't know, all the intricacies, but I would not have said that. So knowing, that Moon Knight is a very Jewish character, and then when it gets translated to the screen, that was a little bit of disappointment for me. But I also know that you have a lot of thoughts on not just Moon Knight, but like those things happening, because there is a
Yeah.
lot that we're probably not having enough conversations about to talk about how Jewish representation is still kind of falling to the wayside when we're translating those comics onto the big screen as well.
So this cuts into, what I'll be talking about at Comic-Con, but there's a couple things at play, and I'll talk about Moon Knight.
Hmm.
So first, look at the original X-Men films.
Yes.
And we can debate whether or not a Jewish actor should always play a Jewish character or not.
Hmm.
But at the end of the day, there's never been a Jewish actor to play the Jewish characters. Like, at the very least, Magneto's experiences were still included,
Hmm.
right? Nobody ever forgot that Magneto was a Holocaust survivor. But look at
Hmm.
Kitty Pryde, who was played by Elliot Page in X-Men 3 and then Days of Future Past.
Right.
In the first one, you could argue she was a minor character. She didn't really do all that much, but okay. But in Days of Future Past, like I still get angry when I think about that movie, and many people don't. But Days of Future Past took Kitty's story.
Hmm.
Like, Kitty's the one to go back in time. And not only did they give that story to Wolverine, which I thought was hilarious, and then Bryan Singer was like, well, this is the mode of time travel we use. And I'm like, have you read X-Men? There's like a bazillion different time travel methods you can use. And for all of the talk that Wolverine had to go back in time to bring Charles and Eric back together, which he didn't even succeed in.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. That aside, but so not only do you kind of sideline Kitty Pryde in her own story, in the road cut, she gets sidelined even further.
Yeah.
But she never, and this is the other problem, Jewish characters very rarely share screen time. And when they do, they never talk about anything Jewish. And it's not to say they can't have conversation about other things.
Right.
But like, I was kind of hoping that like Kitty and, Ian McKellen's Magneto were going to talk about the fact that like, this is like a genocide on a scale the world has never seen and how that affects them.
Hmm.
Something similar happened with, in the Arrowverse, in one of the crossovers, they had like an Earth X crossover where they go to like Nazi world.
Yeah.
And the two characters, I'm sorry, there's a cat.
I'm totally leaving this in the video, by the way.
He is
causing trouble.
No, he's playing with the like, he can't twist it, but he's playing with the little metal like thingy that you twist to get your
the arm.
boom arm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So okay, I was like, what is this noise? What is he doing? But yeah, so you have so on the Earth X crossover, you have like the Legends and Arrow characters and Felicity Smoke, who's Jewish, and Dr. Stein, who's Jewish, who's actually a rabbi. And the two literally never have a conversation, as far as I remember, about the fact that they're on Nazi world.
Yeah.
If I'm a Jewish person,
yeah,
and I'm in this, I'm like, I wouldn't want to leave the ship. Like, forget anything else. Like, I'm like, you can't, no. I'm getting back on the ship and I'm hightailing it back to Earth 1.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting, because I didn't even know about those things about those characters. So yeah, I mean, that's definitely an oversight that you think somebody would have brought that to someone's attention. And yeah.
But that leads to another problem. I think there's a lack of Jewish people in the room who are, comfortable, content, and proud of their Jewish identity to speak up for this kind of thing.
Right.
So, like, to go back to Moon Knight, because I wasn't going to let that go. Moon Knight, as far as I could tell, between the writers, the directors, the creative team, didn't have a single Jewish person. There's one Jewish person that I found in the credits who is in charge of the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society. She's a rabbi. Can't remember her name right now. And she's listed as a consultant. And I was like, you hired a consultant and this is what you gave us.
Right.
Either they asked her the wrong questions or they ignored the advice she gave them, because I don't understand how. I bet you anything, and I hope the showrunner will respond to me about this. Like, like no ill will towards them, but I'm just thinking, like, did you just call her and ask her a couple questions about what like Jewish funeral practices are?
Right. Yeah.
And even then, like if somebody wrote an article about how I think they were going to, because of Oscar Isaac's being cast as Moon Knight, they were going to lean more into the Sephardic background of the character.
Oh, okay.
Except they didn't. Not in the Shiva or any point. So let's get to Moon Knight. Yes, the creator, the showrunner, whoever they were in the show, people tweeted at him. And instead of just not saying anything, he said, wait till the end, you won't be disappointed. And a friend of mine texted me this. And I said, I think I'm going to be anyway. That being said, I didn't come into the show hoping to be disappointed.
Right.
It wasn't like within my, like, I didn't want to be disappointed. I wanted to have a positive Jewish character. Granted, Mark Spector has a very complicated relationship with everything, but especially his Jewish identity, whether it's ethnic or religious, because of how he grew up and the experiences that he had. Mm-hmm. And the show didn't show any of that, didn't even say that.
Right.
They gave him an abusive mom that didn't exist in the comics.
Right.
They didn't even note that his father was a rabbi, even though, like, literally the first time his father appears on a panel.
Yeah.
Like, he just, like, like, I don't understand. But okay, fine. And then you get to this, you get, like, the two background Shiva scenes. And keep in mind, Mark never interacts with anything Jewish.
Right.
He doesn't attend either Shiva, which, like, first of all, I don't think children attend Shivas, which are, like, you know, but fine. Okay, he doesn't interact with anything Jewish. The only Jewish moment we have with him is this moment where he, like, cries and drops his kippah to the ground. I'm not gonna lie, first time I watched it, I started laughing.
No kidding.
100% laughing my ass off, because the moment had zero emotional impact for me. Mm-hmm. I had absolutely no clue what the heck he was crying at. Was he crying about his dead mom, his lost childhood, his kippah? Because then he, like, picks up the kippah and he, like, clutches it and cries more. And I'm like, is he crying over the kippah? Like, was the kippah, like, right? And somebody was like, well, the Judaism connected to his mom. And I'm like, how? We never see it.
Right.
His mother, as far as we can tell, didn't use Judaism to abuse him. Mm-hmm. We don't even really see him abuse him other than verbally. Thank God. I would not have wanted to see that.
Right.
Right. Right? My cat has the zoomies. But, you know, so you have these, like, ridiculous things that are supposed to, like, give us, they're there for backstory for the character. Mm-hmm. But you have to explain to us in some way, shape, or form what they mean. Mm-hmm. Why do we care that Mark threw the kippah on the ground and then clutched it and cried about it? Mm-hmm. It's nothing. It has zero emotional impact for the audience. If a Jewish person cannot understand how a Jewish character has it, like, what that means to him, then how can not Jewish people understand that? Mm-hmm. Right? And so, you know, I wrote about this in my Comics Watch article about Marvel's Jewish voices and Where Are They article. Mm. And it was just such an empty scene that they could have cut it completely and just left it with Mark, like, you know, waving to his dad, walking back, crying, falling to the ground, and waking up as Jake. No, not Jake.
Mark.
Steven.
Or Steven, sorry,
Steven. And then just walked away. Like, nothing. Like, it was a well-acted scene, don't get me wrong. Mm-hmm. But that's all it had going for it.
Right.
You could tell, like, even, like, a year after it came out, I'm still livid about it, because I don't understand how you can tell us we won't be disappointed and then, like, not even think consciously about, like, well, are people going to understand what happened here?
Yeah.
And I think the issue is, at the end of the day, is that the show didn't focus on Mark. He's, like, a secondary character, honestly. The focus is on Steven and Khonshu, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And the one thing that the comics finally addressed this, and I was hoping the show would, was this idea of a Jewish guy, right, becoming a vessel for an Egyptian god. Like, there's some, like, this is, like, biblical level, like
exactly. That's what I was thinking. Yeah.
Right. And so there's a scene, and I think the last episode, spoilers for Moon Knight, where Layla gets the chance to become a vessel for the hippo goddess. And she's like,
yes.
I don't know how I feel about that. And I was like, wait, so she can have this discussion, but Mark can't?
You're right. Yeah.
You know? And I'm glad it was a good discussion, because you're essentially giving away a part of yourself to an deity of some kind that you might not even believe in. And there's like, I'm glad that they addressed that for Layla, but I'm like, we couldn't get like a 2-second conversation between Mark and Khonshu?
Yeah.
No? Okay.
Right.
So then you get into the question of like, should a Jewish actors play Jewish characters? And, acting is acting. And I don't think in every instance for every single character, you always need a Jewish actor.
Mm-hmm.
But the more nonsensical Jewish representation, I'm going to put air quotes around that at this point,
right,
that I see, the more I'm convinced you need to. But it can't just be a Jewish actor on the screen. It has to be Jewish people behind the scenes too.
Mm-hmm.
So I coined something called the Afikoman effect.
Okay.
It came out of my detest for the Fantastic Four movie that came out in 2016. The one everybody called Fanforstic.
Yeah.
So there's a scene where we meet young Ben Grimm, and he crosses into his parents' home,
and
there's a menorah on the shelf. And I'm like, she's going to be part of the plot. It's great. No. That blink and you miss it menorah was the only indication that Ben was Jewish. It was never referenced, mentioned again, and the menorah never appeared either. So that is the Afikoman effect.
Mm-hmm.
It is the idea of it's a fake promise of representation you're not going to get.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, in the Hawkeye show, which takes place in the run-up to Christmas, there's a moment where Kate and Clint are talking, and they're at her aunt's apartment, and there's a menorah in the background, and everybody's like, "Oh, this is Jewish," and I just went, "What the heck is this? This is a prop. This is an awkward background decoration that they set up because Haley Steinfeld is Jewish."
Mm-hmm.
Which, like, kudos that they put it there. But everybody's like, Kate is Jewish. Kate is Jewish. I'm like, no, she's not. Never been a thing in the comics. If you want to make her Jewish, like, fine, go for it. By all means, go for it. But you can't just put a menorah in the background and call it good. That's not representation. That's like, it's sort of like when you have a really big blockbuster movie, right? And you want to show how diverse it is. And the way that you show it's diverse, there's like one gay character that appears in like 2 seconds as like a store clerk. Right. And that's it.
Yeah.
Like, that's not representation, right?
Mm-hmm.
So then why would we not accept that as why would we call this out as not representation for certain groups, but we would accept this as representation for the Jewish community? And I felt like the producers put it there just like, yeah, we gotta shoot something because Hanukkah, like, yeah. Like, you have a show with Christmas celebrating characters in a run up to Christmas. That menorah means literally nothing. Like, it would have been fine if it wasn't there. Like, really.
Yeah. Well, and just as you said, it was at her aunt's house, right? Or her aunt's apartment. So,
and we don't even know who this aunt is or how they're related.
Yes, exactly. Because it could be her aunt from, like, her mom's, brother married her or something like that, right? And so it could be that, like, her aunt is Jewish, but she's not because they're, related by marriage as opposed to, blood marriage and things like that. But yeah, I mean, I'm just saying, like, it just like what you said, it's not established or clear why that menorah was there. And it's almost like kind of cheap points, for them to kind of put something in there and be like, here you go, like representation.
What's even funny is, like, we don't even know if this aunt is in any way related, whether by marriage or by blood, to Kate. She could be like one of those, like, mom's college, like dorm mom or something that, kind of got adopted into the family. Like, it could be like anything.
Yeah.
So it's ridiculous. And now, of course, because I know when you asked, like, what I wanted to bring up, this is one of the things. Joe Locke, who was the actor from Heartstoppers, he played Charlie, has been cast in an undisclosed role for, excuse me, for Agatha, Coven of Chaos. And the speculation by pretty much maybe not everyone, the vast majority, and one like leaker person, or commentator says that he's playing Billy Kaplan. Now, Joe Locke, as far as I know and have been able to Google, is not Jewish.
Right.
The casting call for the character that he's been cast in, which was a leading character, did not specify a Jewish actor. It specified a gay actor, which great, phenomenal.
Right.
If he is playing Billy, there's two problems here. One, Joe Locke is not Jewish, and two, Marvel Studios specifically chose not to look for a Jewish actor. They didn't even specify that in the casting call. Right. So, Joe Locke is a young actor. I think this is his like second major role that he's ever had. If I got cast in, in a Marvel movie and maybe I wasn't the right religion or ethnicity, like I don't know, I would probably struggle whether I could accept that kind of role. And like, I want to say that, like, yeah, for sure, I would like totally reject it and throw it away, but I can't say that. Like, you don't know what you're going to do. You don't know what like you're being told versus like what your agent and the producers are telling you. Right. So I don't begrudge him for accepting this role. It's also entirely possible that he doesn't know the character is Jewish if he is playing Billy Kaplan, because it all depends on the comics. Excuse me, I'm getting over a cold. Right. We don't know what kind of comics he was given to read. And the unfortunate problem with certain comics and certain writers is the question of Jewish erasure, which is essentially what I've kind of been talking around.
Right.
The erasing of a character's background or identity or ethnicity or something about them that is like a key part of who he is. Billy Kaplan is, if the wedding wasn't obvious, he's Jewish.
Right.
He identifies as Jewish. A character he's never met knew he was Jewish. In the prelude to Children's Crusade in Uncanny X-Men 526. See, that one I remember. Dr. Nemesis. So they're on Genosha, or what's left of Genosha. And Magneto is like recovering from something. I don't know what it was. And he talks to Dr. Nemesis, and Dr. Nemesis has this like collage of like different the Young Avengers. And he talks about each of the characters, and Billy and Tommy are last. And he says, "Oh, and this is, Wiccan, who some people, he though calls himself Wiccan, is actually Jewish, and some speculate that he and his the speedster Tommy are your grandchildren." So Dr. Nemesis doesn't know Billy's real name. Right. But he somehow knows he's Jewish. And, some people are like, well, he's not like, he doesn't have like strong Jewish identity in the comics. I'm like, that's not the fault of the character. That's the fault of writers who, for whatever reason, chose not to include a lot of that, which like, fine. But he's also a character whose Jewish identity has been erased on multiple occasions. Everything from a comment about him being a lapsed Jew, which like, you can be a lapsed Catholic, but you cannot be a lapsed Jew.
Right. Yeah.
And other, like the Death's Head comic, I think is one of the most egregious examples, where Billy is drawn in like this goth fashion with like cross earrings. Like, look, I've met a lot of secular Jews. I've met Jews who are atheist Jews, even like, Jews that are like very much not religious, but they don't wear crosses either.
I was about to say, yeah. That's very off-brand. Not off-brand, but it's very not characteristic of, yeah.
Yeah, but like I said, like I think what was it? But again, it's not all bad, but this is something that is the unfortunate reality. That like, yes, I'm so sorry Billy doesn't walk around every comic book and say, "Hey, I'm Jewish. Hey, did I tell you I'm Jewish? By the way, I'm Jewish." But he has these visible Jewish moments. Like, again, a character he didn't know he was Jewish, knew he was Jewish. He, in his own internal monologue, he describes himself as a gay Jewish Avenger. He has a Jewish wedding.
Yeah.
You can't just tell me this person's Jewish identity doesn't mean anything. Yeah, it's not Magneto being a Holocaust survivor, but it is a part of who he is. It's his ethnic identity. His parents are a cardiologist and a psychologist. That is like, joking, like Obviously
Right.
joking, but like, how Jewish can you get when both of your parents are doctors?
Right. Yeah.
But joking aside, that is a real concern, and it devolved into like a whole slew on Twitter that I've sort of backed away from because I'm just like, this is
Yeah.
too much. Like, that's a lot of mental headspace I don't have right now when I don't even know if he's playing Billy, but I am genuinely concerned because look, Wanda Maximoff's entire Romani identity was completely erased.
Right. Yeah.
Right? And even if we don't include her being, Magneto's daughter and being Jewish through him, all of that jazz, which never like as far as I remember was not like it is a part of who she is, and the Red Skull definitely let her know she was Jewish, but it's not something that she herself has explored.
Right.
So, okay, that like I can personally, I know not everyone can, but I can forgive them for not including the Jewish side of this. The
Right.
Romani side not being included is like absolutely unacceptable. Right? Moon Knight. That speaks for itself. But on the flip side to Moon Knight, you have Miss Marvel.
Right.
Miss Marvel is like first, like we can talk about changes to her powers, like that doesn't matter in this case.
Right.
She struggles with who she is. Like, hey, every teenager that comes from an immigrant background struggles with who they are and how they fit into this world.
Right. Yeah.
So her parents came from Pakistan and they carry a lot of the history and trauma with the partition and everything, even though like they were born after the partition.
Right.
Right. But they still have that. And I was like, that resonated with me. Like, her being a kid and just wanting to be normal and, her parents like that. Everybody can resonate with, a kid wanting to break away from the traditions of their parents, whether you're Muslim or Catholic or whatever.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And the show never let us forget who Kamala is and what makes her this amazing young woman. It's not that she's just a young woman. It's just that she comes from this beautiful, Pakistani Muslim family. And the casting is on point. I think overwhelmingly, everybody cast was either Pakistani Muslim or Indian or Pakistani and Muslim. And so like you can tell a lot of attention and effort and love went into not just making what I thought was a great series, but really tackling these complex issues of the partition and the chaos that ensued, even though it's a very minor part of the story. It gets its moment to really tell you about it and you get to sit in that space, metaphorically speaking.
Right. Right.
And you get to see Kamala sort of find her niche because she doesn't hate who she is. She's very proud of who she is. She doesn't hate being Muslim. She doesn't hate being Pakistani or anything like that. She's just trying to figure out how to be herself while still being the person and respecting her family and faith and heritage. And that's throughout the course of the entire show. And I gotta be honest, I was so jealous watching this. I was so incredibly jealous.
I can understand, yeah.
My first reaction was, this is beautiful, and I am never gonna get to see this for myself.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I agree because Miss Marvel did a great job of, and just like what you said, including that identity of her being Pakistani and Muslim as part of the show, and not just as what I call like a throwaway, where it's like, here, this is representation of who they are. Now we can move on, type of thing. But we see multiple scenes in their, in the mosque that they attend, and multiple, I know they were celebrating one holiday, but just multiple instances of where the Islamic practice is being, portrayed and things like that. And it's a great example of how you can incorporate those things of the identity and make it part of the story that's natural and great and everything about that. So I agree completely that that's a really good show that kind of shows that this can be done and done well. And it's just unfortunate.
Also, aside from that, it also tackled prejudice really well.
Yes.
There's the scene where like the agents storm the mosque.
Yes.
And they're like, yeah, we're used to this. Like, you can't really intimidate us anymore. Like, don't you have like listening devices planted? I'm like, oh, you went there.
Yeah. Like it's routine for them. Like their response is routine. It's still routine for them to just storm the mosque. That's routine for their reaction as well too. Yeah. Oh yeah.
Also, I love the part where the two boys, one who's Muslim and one who isn't, are running away, and the imam gives them the hats when the one says haram and the one says halal.
Yeah.
I laughed probably for 5 minutes. I had to pause it to just laugh about it. And there's a beautiful scene where I think it's midway through the show, where Kamala has this conversation with her imam about, or what was his name? Sheikh Abdullah, I believe his name was.
Right.
And, about like the question of like doing the right thing and being a hero and what that means and like how how the Sheikh views this, mysterious figure that later becomes Miss Marvel. And I'm just like, show me where you've ever seen a character have an earnest conversation with a rabbi and asking for advice in like any show, in any movie. Actually, well, okay. The one thing I can think of is in Robin Hood Men in Tights.
Oh my gosh! Yeah.
And
that would make sense. Yeah.
Robin Hood and. Robin Hood actively, he doesn't they don't show us him actually, seeking advice from the rabbi, but he says, Rabbi, will you share with us some of your wisdom and perhaps some of your wine? I'm like,
yeah,
that's a humorous example, obviously, but,
right.
And, that's not even tackling like the religious Jewish side of this, which is like, where does it even exist in comics?
Right.
Right. Like, Nightcrawler, Miss Marvel, these are really devoted characters to not just being a hero or a mutant or whatever, but to being of their faith.
Right. Yeah.
But yes, we have like one scene of Ben Grimm doing his thing mitzvah at the synagogue, which is amazing. But there's a lot, again, there's like moments, but there's no storylines, and they're very few and far between comparatively.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for this great conversation. I really enjoyed this. This is really good to hear. Your perspective about Jewish representation in comics, and this was just a fantastic conversation. So I really
hopefully I wasn't too ranty because
no.
I have feelings.
I could not tell at all.
No, not at all.
No, well, and I completely understand that as well too. And I think I shared that with you. Like, even though I'm not Jewish, just that whole thing with Moon Knight, I was like, I was disappointed myself. I'm not even part of that community, It's just, yeah. So I totally get that. So, but thank you for sharing all that and giving us insight about representation in comics. I like to end this episode with talking about the comics that we're reading. So to start off with, I want to share what people have shared with me on social media, but also in our Comic Watch Slack communication that we're using. So John Jack said that he is reading Amazing Spider-Man currently, which I know he also just submitted a review for it. And he's really excited about that. And then our editor-in-chief, Matt Myers, said that he is reading the early Bronze Age of Thomas and Buscema Fantastic Four. I think I pronounced that right.
I think it's Buscema.
Buscema? No? Okay. I wasn't too far off then. And then B Rats said Avengers No Surrender, the most Avengers-y Avengers story since the end of the Kurt Busiek run. So that's what those three are reading. And then on Twitter, I had at Luke W. Henderson M said from the static and dark side of purity from Band of Bards and the gigantic beard that was evil by Stephen Collins. I gotta be honest, I don't think I've ever heard any of those comics there. I've heard of Band of Bards. They're like a small publisher, if I remember correctly, but I've never heard of those comics. So those are really interesting to hear about that. And I'm glad to hear that people are, sharing the indie comics and not just the big two or even the, I don't know what you would call like Dark Horse and Image and IDW and all that, like minor, producers or publishers or whatever. But it's good to, hear some of those indies as well too. So Sasha, what comics are you currently reading?
I'm always reading like 5,000 things at once. So
I feel you because I have a stack that I'm going to share. Yeah.
So I just finished reading some of the Avatar: The Last Airbender comics and some of the Avatar Korra comics. Those were really good.
Yeah.
My brother got me a very thick, I think this is Lee and Ditko's Spider-Man run that was
Mm-hmm.
reprinted. So I'm really excited to delve into some of those early Spider-Man comics.
Nice.
And to get a little bit indie here, one of the things I always try to reread at least once a year is Check Please, which is
Uh-huh.
a very sweet comic that was self-published. It's about hockey players and
Oh, I gotta
baking,
read it now. Yeah.
and it's like cozy reading.
Uh-huh.
And the characters are so good and the writing is amazing. The art is so fun, and I always recommend Check Please.
Well, I love hockey, so the fact that you said it's about hockey players, I'm sold. So I will definitely. And what do you remember what publisher that is?
I think if you just Google, I think you can actually still read the entire comic online on the website Check Please Comic.
Oh, okay. I'll definitely check that out. So, and if anyone's interested, I'll try to find the link to that and put it in the show notes as well too. So but yeah, I definitely got to check that out now. So cool. Well, I am reading like a whole slew of comics. One of them is The Last Ronin Lost Years, issue number 1 that just came out recently. I actually read that. And I read the 5 issues of the Last Ronin series. And so it's fantastic. Like it goes on top of what we read in Last Ronin, and it kind of does a little like before and after type of thing, which I find really interesting. And they're telling new stories about it. So I absolutely love that. So this is a really good one that I'm glad I'm pulling. I want to highlight this one because this one I got to give a shout out to Kim from the ODPH podcast. He's been really promoting this, but this is Inferno Girl Red, and it is a brand
That's
new
a
one.
cool cover.
It is a very cool cover, and the art is really cool. I gotta say, so not to give too many details away, but you see a couple of different suits for Infernal Girl Red, and they are fantastic, and just the details are really cool. This is from Image Comics, and I guess from what I've read, they've spent like I think about 3 years making this happen. And it is. I'm just so glad I read it because it was just phenomenal. I couldn't put it down, and I just enjoyed it so much. So yeah, so I just finished that, and then I need to get started on where did I pull it up here? Oh no, it's this big one. Yeah, sorry. So let me pull this up here, but I didn't realize how big this book was. But this is almost like twice the size of a regular comic book. Yeah. It's the
It's
whole
bigger than
series.
your head.
I know, like that's the thing. Like when I went to pick this up at my comic shop, I was like, "Is this supposed to be that big?" And they're like, "Yeah, that's how it is." I was like, "I did not realize that when I ordered it." But yeah, it's Electra, Black, White, and Blood. So they just had wrapped up that whole series a while back. I know David Pepos was on it as a writer, but yeah, so I this is probably one of the biggest comic books. It's not thick by any means, but in terms of the size and everything, it's probably one of the biggest ones I have that I don't even know if I'm going to be able to put on my shelf. So, but yeah, so those are the ones I'm reading this week, and hopefully I'll get through it. So, well, Sasha, thank you very much for joining the show. This was a pleasure talking to you about this, and I think this is something that we're going to see more of, and we're going to have more conversations about as well too. Especially like what you said, if we see Billy Kaplan in the MCU, that's a conversation that we need to continue about Jewish representation in comics and the screen as well too. I did want to ask you before I let you go, where can our listeners find you and your work online?
I mean, obviously on oh goodness, Comic Watch. Getting back into doing comic book reviews. You can always find me on Twitter and Instagram. It's at Geeky Kaplan. Kaplan, after, of course, the greatest superhero in the Marvel Universe, Billy Kaplan. And, Sean, thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun. And we didn't even tackle DC Comics because, I just wanted to rant about Marvel.
I know. Well, yeah, that was that's a whole different conversation that we could maybe we'll do a follow-up sometimes, like Jewish representation in DC Comics.
What Jewish representation in DC Comics?
Which is, and not to get sidetracked too much, but I agree with you completely because I guess I never realized that Harley Quinn was Jewish until, like you said, the holiday special. And I don't know if this is a recent development, but I read, oh gosh, what's it called? I think it's Batman, Catwoman, holiday special, I think is probably where I read this at. But they talked about Bruce Wayne's mother being Jewish, like as kind of like a side conversation. And I was just like, that's the first time I've ever heard that Batman may have been Jewish, and so it's
first cousin, Kate Kane, is Jewish, and
Yes.
the two moms, were sisters. So
yes, so that makes sense. Yeah, so yeah, and to be completely honest, I've never read a lot of Batwoman comics. I didn't even know that detail until I think when I was actually I was doing some research way before this episode. I remember like just thinking about Jewish characters in comics, and her name came up. I was like, oh, I didn't even know about that. So yeah, but well, I will make sure to put links to your social media and to your articles on Comic Watch in the show notes as well too. Again, thank you very much. I would love to have you back on to talk about Jewish representation and lack of in DC Comics. But thanks again. I really appreciate it.
thank you so much for having me.
And that wraps up another episode of The Captioned Life. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button. You can follow us on social media at Captioned Life. For more information about us and all of our previous episodes, visit thecaptionedlife.com.